Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Chapter 5, in which we'll be learning about learning. So, what is learning? Learning is a relatively enduring change in behavior or thinking that results from experience. And when you think about it, at some level, once you learn something, if you learn somebody's name, you learn how to do a math problem, you learn how to ride a bike, some kind of experience has to be changing our nervous system. And now that we know what the nervous system is, it's made up of cells called neurons, and they connect at synapses and send messages. When you learn something, something in that nervous system with those neurons and their connections are changing. When we talk about learning, a stimulus, that's an event or object that leads to a change in behavior. So the stimulus is something that's going to lead to a change in behavior. Very simple learning, which we've even seen in very simple organisms, things like something called an aplesia, which is a sea slug, basically, a very simple sea slug. We see this very simple kind of learning called habituation, in which an organism doesn't respond as strongly or as often to an event following multiple exposures to it. So habituation is basically a learning that after you've been exposed to a particular stimulus over and over again, the organism stops responding. Here's an example. If you're a parent or have ever babysat or worked with children, that here you the parent reading a book and child banging a loud drum. Now, the first time that child bangs a loud drum, the parent probably jumps up. Oh my gosh, what was that noise, right? That's scary. Did someone fall? Did someone hurt themselves? Nope, it's just playing. The second time they hear the drum, they might look up, but remember, it's just the drum. And eventually, the parent learns every time they hear that noise, this is nothing to be worried about, and their nervous system stops responding. You stop even really hearing it as loudly as you did before, and you stop getting that response of looking up and being worried. And so that's a very simple form of learning, that all of a sudden this stimulus, the loud banging of a drum, starts to not lead to the same response. Okay. There are three types of learning that we'll talk about: classical conditioning, and classical conditioning has to do with associations between two different stimuli. We'll talk about operant conditioning, where you're making connections between behaviors and consequences, and observational learning, where people watch and imitate others. So we'll start with classical conditioning, and this is a type of learning in which a neutral stimulus comes to bring about a response after it is paired, or you could say associated, with a stimulus that naturally brings about that response. So this kind of conditioning, classical conditioning, is about pairing or associating. And this was the very classic Pavlov's experiment. You may have heard of this at some point in your life. If not, we talk about it as psychologists in Psych 101, and you'll talk about it quite a bit in more psychology classes that you take. Classical conditioning, there are a number of different terms, and so I'm going to go back and forth between this slide and the slide after it. So we'll go through and kind of look at the classic experiment. Number one, you need a neutral stimulus. And in this case, we're looking at our neutral stimulus is a bell, the sound of a bell ringing, and our subject, our participant, is a dog in this study. And so a neutral stimulus, the sound of a bell, means it's neutral. If you ring a bell, typically a dog doesn't have a specific natural response or an instinctual response. They'll ignore it. I don't know. No, there's no particular response that all dogs give to the sound of a bell. So the neutral stimulus down here, this stimulus does not naturally bring about the response of interest. Okay. Sorry, going backwards. And so when you have the sound of a bell, you get an unrelated response. Maybe the dog pricks up its ears a little bit, it listens to the sound, but that's just not at all what we're looking for. Now, we have what we call an unconditioned stimulus, UCS. An unconditioned stimulus leads to what we call an unconditioned response. In this case, the unconditioned stimulus is meat. So the stimulus, what you're presenting to the dog, is meat. And the unconditioned response is salivation, meaning you do not need to train the dog to do this. If you show a dog meat, any dog meat, they are going to salivate. That's the unconditioned response. So back here, the unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that naturally brings about a particular response without having to be learned. This is just a natural response. So meat is the unconditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response is a natural, innate, reflexive response. It's unlearned, which is salivation to meat. All right, so at this point we haven't done any learning. Now we want to get to the learning part. What we want to do is have this dog start to salivate when he hears the bell. And so we go through a conditioning process or a learning process where you pair ringing the bell, the neutral stimulus, and showing the dog food, the unconditioned stimulus. And the dog will salivate because there's the meat. And you do this over and over. Ring the bell, show the food, the dog salivates. Ring the bell, show the food, the dog salivates. Over and over and over again. So you present the neutral stimulus along with the unconditioned stimulus, the meat, and you get the unconditioned response, which is salivation. And the dog is salivating because there's the meat. It's unconditioned and it's not learned at this point. But after you go through a set of trials, a set of pairings, what happens is all you have to do is ring the bell and the dog will salivate. And this now has two different names. The bell changes from being a neutral stimulus to now being what we call a conditioned stimulus. Conditioned means learned. It's a learned. The dog has learned that the sound of the bell means something. And what does it mean? It means he's about to get food. And so the conditioned response, or the learned response, is salivation. But when you can see that the response between the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are the same. In both cases, it's salivation. But the unconditioned response is salivation in response to meat. That's the unlearned response. The conditioned response is salivation in response to hearing the sound of a bell. That's a learned response. That's something you don't see naturally. So the conditioned stimulus is once the neutral stimulus paired with the unconditioned stimulus starts to bring about a response that was formerly caused by the bell. And the conditioned response is a response that after conditioning follows a previously neutral stimulus. And so that's salivation to the bell. So back here again, we have our neutral stimulus, the bell. Doesn't really mean anything to a dog. We have our unconditioned stimulus, that's the meat. And our unconditioned response is salivating in response to meat. Then during conditioning, these are our pairing or an association trials where you ring the bell, show the meat, and the dog salivates. Ring the bell, show the meat, the dog salivates. Ring the bell, show the meat, the dog salivates. And eventually, after conditioning, you end up with a conditioned stimulus. The neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus. That's the sound of the bell. And the conditioned response is salivating in response to the sound of the bell. Some hints on classical conditioning. As I said, there are a lot of terms. Conditioned means learned response. Unconditioned is not learned. An unconditioned stimulus leads to an unconditioned response. Unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response pairing. So that's the meat and the salivation. Unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response pairings are unlearned and untrained. They happen naturally. During conditioning, a previously neutral stimulus is transformed into the conditioned stimulus. And now the conditioned stimulus leads to the conditioned response. A conditioned stimulus, conditioned response pairing, which would be the bell leading to salivation, is a consequence of learning and training. Remember, conditioned means learning. The unconditioned and conditioned response are similar. Like I said, they're both salivation, but the unconditioned response occurs naturally, salivation in response to meat, and the conditioned response is learned. How does this affect human behavior? Can we go beyond Pavlov? Well, human behavior is also learned through classical conditioning. Particularly, there's been a lot of research on emotional responses such as fear. And there was a study done many years ago with a very famous baby now, little Albert, who's not a baby anymore, the experiment was to condition little Albert to show a fear of rats. And so what they did, we had a neutral stimulus, which was a rat. Typically, if you show a baby a rat, they're not afraid of it. They look at it, they're interested in it, they watch it run around, but they're not afraid of it. The unconditioned stimulus was a loud noise. They banged a loud metal bar, which if you make a very loud noise like that near a baby, they get scared and start crying. The unconditioned response is fear shown to that loud noise. The conditioned stimulus is the rat, and the conditioned response would be the fear of the rat. So what happened? Initially, they showed the baby the rat, and there was no response. Then they started pairing the rat with the loud noise. Every time they showed the rat, they banged that loud metal bar, and the baby, little Albert, would be afraid. The rat, the loud noise, the baby would be afraid. The rat, the loud noise, the baby would be afraid. Eventually, all they had to do was show little Albert the conditioned stimulus, the rat, and you would get the conditioned response of fear of the rat. Of course, we can think about the ethical implications of doing this to a poor baby and making him afraid of rats for many years to come. But we can think about that, and we take a lot of classes in ethics and psychology, so that's something that we would discuss in a class on research and ethics. Again, classical conditioning and human behavior conditioning can lead to phobias or intense irrational fears. So if you're on a plane, everything's fine, and there's turbulence, which makes you very afraid, then eventually just seeing that airplane can make you afraid because you've conditioned seeing a plane or being on a plane to that sense of fear from the turbulence. We can see conditioning leading to post-traumatic stress disorder. We see that war veterans are often fearful or have a very over-exaggerated response to loud noises, but certainly being in a war situation where loud noises can be deadly, can be bombs and all sorts of things that that someone should be fearful of. Then when they're back home and hear a loud noise like a door slam, you get this very extreme fearful response because of the conditioning experience that they went through. And conditioning can also lead to positive thoughts and feelings as well. For instance, your significant other wears a particular cologne or perfume, and then you end up pairing that smell with feelings of love and happiness. And if you're walking down the street and you smell that perfume, it may have you feel warm, positive feelings, even though that it's not that you've actually seen your significant other. All right, other principles of classical conditioning. Extinction. Extinction means that a previously conditioned response starts to decrease in frequency and will eventually disappear. In extinction, you're ending the association between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. So let's take a look at this graph. Sometimes I think it's easier to look at the picture as opposed to the words. So this is time, and this is the strength of the conditioned response. And so the conditioned response, we're going back to Pavlov, is salivating at the sound of the bell. So during the training period, you're showing the dog, you're ringing the bell, showing the meat, the dog is salivating. Ringing the bell, showing the meat, the dog is salivating. Ringing the bell, showing the meat, the dog is salivating. And you're getting this stronger and stronger response because the dog is realizing and learning. Every time I hear that bell, I see that meat, yum, and you get this very strong salivation. At this point, the training ends. And now you're just ringing the bell. I ring the bell, and you get the conditioned response of salivation. Ring the bell, get the conditioned response of salivation. But if you keep ringing the bell over time and never show the dog the meat again, now you're just ringing the bell, the dog starts to salivate less and less and less. This is called extinction. That all of a sudden the dog is unlearning this association, saying, hey, wait a minute, now I'm hearing the bell and I'm not getting any food. So why am I salivating? And eventually you'll go back to no salivating in response to the bell. Spontaneous recovery means that you get this reemergence of an extinguished conditioned response after a period of rest. And so what happens is after you've done this, you've trained the dog to salivate at the sound of the bell. Now you keep ringing the bell without any meat, without any food, and so you get this, the salivating in response to the bell has been extinguished. It's gone. You can ring the bell and not get any salivation. And then if you have a little pause and ring the bell again, you get what we call spontaneous recovery. All of a sudden the dog salivates again. Maybe it's thinking, maybe now that we took that break, it's like a little bit hopeful. I'm going to get the meat again. And so you get some salivation again. This is again just to the sound of the bell. You get spontaneous recovery after a break. A little bit, and then again, if you keep just ringing the bell, it extinguishes again. Stimulus generalization is the idea that a conditioned response follows a stimulus that is similar to the original conditioned stimulus. The greater the similarity, the greater the likelihood for generalization. So Pavlov's dog salivated, he taught them with a bell, but he could also get them to salivate to a buzzer. The buzzer was similar enough in sound to the bell that you would get that same response. The response generalizes. Now, you wouldn't get them to salivate to any sound. Like if I clapped my hands, that wouldn't make them salivate. So something similar enough, a stimulus that's similar enough, you could elicit the same response. And it turns out for poor little Albert, he ended up being afraid of all white furry animals. They did this study, the conditioning study with a white rat, and he ended up becoming afraid of all small white furry animals. So he had stimulus generalization. And as I mentioned, stimulus discrimination means if two stimuli are sufficiently different from each other, one would bring about the conditioned response, but the other doesn't. So again, Pavlov's dogs would salivate to a bell, to a buzzer, but not the sound of a can opener or not the sound of me clapping. Those sounds are sufficiently different that they don't bring upon the conditioned response. Higher order conditioning is that with repeated pairings of a conditioned stimulus and a second neutral stimulus, the second neutral stimulus can become a conditioned stimulus as well. So if we have the bell and the food, right, the neutral stimulus is the bell, the unconditioned stimulus is the food, and the unconditioned response is salivation. And after conditioning, continually pairing the bell and the food together, you get a conditioned stimulus, a bell, and a conditioned response, which is salivating in response to the bell. But higher order conditioning means you take that conditioned stimulus, the bell here, and start to pair that with a light bulb, a second neutral stimulus. Bell, light bulb, salivation. Bell, light bulb, salivation. Now, for higher order conditioning, the light bulb can become a conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response is now salivating when the light goes on. So that's another level. Applications, taste aversion. This is a very powerful form of classical conditioning that occurs when an organism learns to associate the taste of a particular food or drink with illness. This may have happened to you. If you ever got food poisoning or the stomach flu right after eating something, you don't want to eat that food again for a long time. This is a very quick classical conditioning pairing. In fact, it only really needs to be paired once, that you eat something and then you get sick, and then you just don't want that food again. It doesn't take multiple pairings of eating the food and being sick. It's a one-time deal. And you can see that this is very adaptive from an evolutionary perspective because maybe out, again, long ago, evolutionarily, if you ate something that was poisonous, not good for you, and got sick and threw up, then you would learn very quickly, I better not eat that again, right? So your natural body instinct of saying, ugh, I don't want that food, is very protective from an evolutionary standpoint. And we use classical conditioning in marketing and advertising as well. Advertisements try to instill emotions and attitudes towards product brands, and it can last up to 3 weeks. In advertising, they take a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus, like repeatedly pairing things like cars, which are a neutral stimulus, with sexually provocative images. That's an unconditioned stimulus. And so if you have all these advertisements with cars and sexually provocative images, that's the pairing. Then you get a learned response that people have this positive kind of or sexual arousal kind of image when seeing the product. It's very positive. And so people start to think of cars as a very positive kind of thing. Oh, I must have that car. So you could think about as classical conditioning so powerful that it forces us to purchase items we otherwise wouldn't purchase. And this is really a whole part of psychology in terms of marketing and advertising. How do you persuade people to buy things? So if you're interested in that, that is another area of psychology. Operant conditioning, so next type of learning. Operant conditioning is learning in which a voluntary response is strengthened, meaning it's likely to occur more regularly, or weakened, less likely to occur more regularly, depending on favorable or unfavorable consequences. Again, this is very much like parenting. How do we get a child to do what we would like them to do? We reward them. We give them a treat. Here's an M&M, here's a sticker. And that seems to increase the behavior that we're looking for. And then, of course, unfavorable consequences. You're grounded for things that we don't want to see. Also with training animals, right? Positive reinforcement when animals are learning how to sit, or training them to go to the bathroom outside, those sorts of things. So that's the idea of operant conditioning. Began with research conducted by B.F. Skinner in the early 1900s. He created a Skinner box, kind of nice. You create something and it gets your name on it forever, which is basically a controlled environment or a cage. And there's a little lever here in this area where food can come out. And the goal was to teach the rat to press the lever for food. So initially when you put the rat in this cage, it just kind of walked around and did its little rat things. I don't know, smelled over here, walked over here, looked up the wall, whatever. But eventually it might have accidentally hit that lever and a food pellet came out. So he would eat the food pellet. And again, he would wander around the cage just being a rat, and then maybe come over here and again accidentally knock this lever and food came out. And so then the rat starts to think, what is it about being over here that's making this food come out? And the rat would maybe stay more on this side of the cage. And again, maybe accidentally hit the lever and food comes out. And he starts to realize, maybe it's this lever. And he might smell the lever, touch the lever, and eventually press the lever. Food comes out. And before long, you have a rat who has learned to just press the lever to get food. So this was the beginnings of behaviorism, started by Skinner, who considered psychology to only be a true science if it restricts itself to the study of behaviors that can be seen and documented. And his thought is, the idea here is that every thought, emotion, and behavior is really shaped by factors in the environment. And this is the perspective of behaviorism that we've talked about before. So some terms for operant conditioning: reinforcement. Reinforcement is the process by which a stimulus increases the probability that a preceding behavior will be repeated. You reinforce things that you want to see. And a reinforcer is any stimulus that increases the probability that the preceding behavior will occur again. So for a rat, a reinforcer would be a food pellet. For a 2-year-old, it might be a sticker or an M&M. I don't know. For a college student, it might be movie tickets or Disneyland tickets. There's all sorts of reinforcers. Now, here's, there are 2 types of reinforcers: positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers. And when we talk about positive and negative in terms of operant conditioning, we're not talking about positive and negative meaning good and bad. We're talking about positive as in a positive sign, an addition sign, something you're adding to the environment that is reinforcing. And when we talk about negative reinforcement, we are talking about something negative like a minus sign, something you're taking away from the environment that is reinforcing. So when we talk about a positive reinforcer, we're talking about something we're adding to the environment that brings an increase in the preceding response. So if you're in a first grade classroom and children get a sticker for behaving well in class, the sticker is a positive reinforcer. You're adding something to the environment, and it will hopefully increase the behaving well in class. Now, a negative reinforcer, like I said, is taking away an unpleasant stimulus. So if you get a good grade on the test, you don't have to help mom do the dishes. So getting a good grade on your test removes an unpleasant stimulus, which is doing the dishes. You don't want to do the dishes, and so if you get a good grade, you don't have to do that. We're removing something unpleasant. So you can think of some examples of positive and negative reinforcement in your own life. In terms of categories of reinforcers, we talk about them as primary reinforcers. Those are reinforcers that satisfy a biological need like food, water, and physical contact. If I only give you, and this would be very unethical, water, if you, clean your room, that would be a primary reinforcer. Again, totally unethical, but an example. A secondary reinforcer, those are reinforcers that don't satisfy biological needs, but often gain power through their association with primary reinforcers. So money, for example. Money doesn't really satisfy one of these biological needs, but it can help you to get some of those things. Grades are also secondary reinforcers, right? Getting an A or a B or a C. The harder you work, the better grade you get, and that should be reinforcing. Again, it's a secondary reinforcer. It's associated with kind of what their meaning is in our society. Same thing about trophies. Where would you consider trophies? Primary or secondary reinforcers. well, and they're very reinforcing, particularly for little children. They want that trophy, right? But I guess at any age we all want a trophy. But those would be in what category? I'll let you think about that. Reinforcement can be used to train animals as well, and to train animals to do pretty amazing things. You can look in your book about training a pigeon to play tennis, but also all of the animal shows you might see at the zoo or SeaWorld or something like that. How do they get those animals to do those long performances? You can't talk to the animal, right? They're using reinforcement and what's called successive approximations and shaping. So successive approximations is a method that uses reinforcers to condition a series of small steps that gradually approach the target behavior. So you start to reinforce any little thing. Pigeon is rewarded with seeds for pecking at the ball. So far we don't see anything. Pecks here, ooh, pecks the ball, we get reinforcement. And then we're going to shape by when the person observes the behaviors of another organisms, providing reinforcers if the organism performs at a required level. And so now we've seen that the pigeon has pecked the ball and been reinforced for that. You start to get more pecking of the ball, right, and more reinforcement. Now we want to get the pigeon to push the ball. So now it's not just pecking, now we need to push to get the reinforcement. And so slowly but surely you get a change in behavior after using reinforcement in this way. There are different schedules of reinforcement, and let me go back, not only for animals. This can be used with children as well as with children or adults who have intellectual disabilities, and you're really trying to help teach them a complex action, a complex set of behaviors to help, get up in the morning and brush their teeth. Someone with severe autism and very significant intellectual impairments, you might start teaching step by step and reinforcing step by step until they're able to do the whole process. Types of reinforcement. There's continuous reinforcement. This is when you reinforce after every target behavior, and this is very effective in establishing the behavior. So back here, every time that pigeon pecks at the ball, they get reinforced for that. And that helps someone learn or some organism learn the behavior quickly. Partial reinforcement is a schedule of reinforcement in which the behaviors are reinforced intermittently, not continuously. And when you do partial reinforcement, the behaviors are more resistant to extinction, meaning you don't lose them as quickly as those acquired through continuous reinforcement. So we can think about this. There are ratio and interval types of reinforcement. So a fixed ratio schedule is that the subject must exhibit a predetermined number of desired responses before you get the reinforcer. So it could be that reinforcement for food pellets is given on every 5th peck. So peck, 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 reinforcement. Peck, 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 reinforcement. Every 5th peck, that's a fixed ratio schedule, the animal gets reinforced. Now, a variable ratio is that the reinforcement is unpredictable. The number of desired responses that must occur before a reinforcer changes between trials. And the average number of you're looking for an average. So maybe on average, they will get a reinforcement every 5 pecks. But in this first case, it was 3. And in this one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And on this one, 4. And so it's a variable ratio. You know the number you're looking for. The average will be 5, but it's not consistent. It's variable between trials. Fixed interval has to do with the timing between reinforcement. So the reinforcer comes after a pre-established interval of time. So for a fixed interval, every 40 seconds, if then there's a peck sometimes in there, the animal gets reinforced. So now he pecks again, sometime in that 40 seconds, and there's a reinforcement. Pecks in here, and every 40 seconds a reinforcer. Now a variable interval is that reinforcement follows the first target response after the time interval has elapsed. The length of the time interval changes from trial to trial. So in this case, it could be 41 seconds, 43 seconds, 40 seconds, etc. So I've got this all in here for you to read. A fixed ratio, what's the good thing about that? It produces a high response rate with a predictable dip in behavior immediately before the reinforcer. So they know I need to do 5 pecks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They do them pretty quick, get their reinforcer. Variable ratio, again, produces a high response rate. Behavior is difficult to extinguish. Fixed interval, the behavior tends to increase as the time interval comes to an end. And variable interval encourages steady patterns of behavior. And you could think about this in a number of different ways. Think about if I were to say to you, I don't know, again, this is not ethical. For every 5th homework assignment you complete, I'll give you $1, right? And so that would be what kind of interval would that be? And how would you respond to that? Or if I said every certain amount of homeworks, I will give you $1. I'm not going to tell you how many, right? What's going to happen to your behavior? So you get different types of responses depending on the reinforcement schedule that you use. Now, punishment is decreasing behavior. A punishment is a stimulus that decreases the probability that a preceding behavior will happen again. Again, positive and negative, we're thinking about these in terms of adding something to the environment or taking something away, because this word positive almost sounds like an oxymoron, but the idea here is that we're adding something unpleasant to the environment. This would be something like spanking a child, which there's a lot of research about the appropriateness of this or not, but spanking a child, that's adding something not that's negative to the environment, hoping to stop a behavior. Now, negative punishment is taking away something that is pleasant as punishment, removing a pleasant stimulus from the environment. Grounding a teenager for breaking curfew, taking away their cell phone, taking away their video games. Those are all forms of negative punishment. Observational learning and cognition, moving on to that third type of learning. This is the idea that we learn by watching other people. And Bandura came up with this social cognitive approach. So we watch another person, that other person is our model. And if you think about it, you learn a lot by just observing others. If you go to anything that's new, a new place, a new club, a new wherever, a new class, in a major you've never been in, maybe a lab that you have never been in, a chemistry lab, and it's all set up different, or whatever it is, a new country, as the book explains, what do you do? You kind of look around and say, what are other people doing? I see, this is what they're doing. I'm going to do the same thing. You learn by watching, right? And children do this all the time. They learn by watching, and that's sometimes really funny when you see your child doing something that you do, particularly if it's something you're not proud of and you realize, they learned that by watching me. I have put Bandura's classic Bobo doll experiment on Canvas, so please watch that. This is a classic experiment where children were placed in a room with an adult model and a Bobo doll. A Bobo doll was one of these plastic clowns that were kind of weighted at the bottom, and you push it over and it bounces back up. Kind of an old-fashioned toy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. And some adults acted very aggressively with this Bobo doll. They shouted, they punched the doll. Others played peacefully with other toys in the room. After the children watched the model, children were then allowed to play with the Bobo doll. And what they found was that children who observed the very aggressive models were more likely to be aggressive themselves against that Bobo doll. Boys were more likely than girls to model aggression, especially if they viewed an aggressive male adult. And boys and girls were equally likely to display verbal aggression. So this is the idea of learning by watching, and certainly the whole controversy of letting children watch violent television and violent video games, and our children learning to be more violent by watching these types of things. And there's quite a lot of research on that as well. So here's our violence in the media. Several correlational studies have found links between exposure to violent media and aggressive behavior. Extensive research evidence indicate that media violence can contribute to aggressive behavior, desensitization to violence, nightmares, and fear of being harmed. And then, of course, is all screen time equal? What about programming with positive models? In one study, researchers had parents change their television shows that preschoolers were viewing, substituting aggression-laden programming with high-quality pro-social educational programming, and they actually saw gains that lasted 6 to 12 months. So there is some research to show that observing violence and aggression in the media can have negative consequences. And I think the key here is can. It is not that it will happen for everyone. It is not a cause and effect. Absolutely, this will happen for everyone. But it is something that you can see. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.